Hi, this is National Master Dan Heisman, and we're here with another video to help you improve your chess game. Sometimes the best way to improve is to go over your game with other players or good players. But also another good way that's very similar is to watch people who play similar to the way you play and see the mistakes they make and try to learn from them so you don't make the same mistakes. That's why I feel it's really important to not only go over lots and lots of master games to see what looks good and what works, but also to go over some well-annotated amateur games to see what are they doing that's wrong that you don't see in the master games, and how do you avoid doing those things, and how do you, if you're the opponent, how do you take advantage of them. Let's look at one of my students' games today. Here we go. My student was black, e4, d6, Peart's defense, d4, knight f6, main line, knight c3, g6, knight f3. You could also play lots of other moves, but that's one of the main lines, like the classical line. Bishop g7, h3. Now h3 is not a terrible move here. If we turn on the engine, Mr. Engine, let's take a look at h3. h3 doesn't make the top three moves, but at least it takes the bishop's best square away from it, and it keeps the knight on the board that's guarding those dark squares in the middle. So by preventing bishop to g4, you do prevent the bishop from removing the guard on the dark squares, and also you take, when you can play a move like h3 and take away your opponent's only good square for a piece, that makes some sense. Now if the bishop on c8 had other great squares to go to right now, then h3 would be a complete waste of time. Alright, so h3, and you can see the engine still says white is ahead by half a pawn, so if that was a terrible waste of time, it would have gone almost down to even. Castle. And now white makes a very common mistake against the Peart's defense. He plays bishop c4, losing his advantage. This allows black to play the center fork trick, and very good for my student, he did. Knight takes e4. All right, now white has to take that knight because black has just taken a pawn, and even though he's going to fall for the center fork trick, he'll get the pawn back. But if he doesn't take the knight, then he just loses a pawn, and that's even worse. So white has to take it, and he does. Knight takes e4. There's the fork. Black decides to get the pawn back by taking it that way. He could also play bishop d3, and then on d takes e4, play bishop takes e4. Queen takes. Now the material is even, except that black has the bishop pair. Black guards the knight instead of moving it. He should have just moved the knight, let's say, back to c3, because now black can pin the knight with the bishop and start to cause problems. So bishop f5, and now the engine says white should counterattack with knight c3, allowing black to take the bishop, allowing black's bishop to take the queen, and then he would take the queen back. Instead, he just castles. Instead he just plays knight fd2. The problem there is he's losing the pawn, and also there's even more pressure coming up. So if I were black, I would just play queen takes d4, win the pawn, and offer the trade of queens. Black's move is actually higher rated by the engine, but it's a little more complicated, so I would have played the simple move. Knight c6 is the more complicated line. Now white could try to hold on to the pawn with a move like c3. If he does, black could play e5 because the white queen will be pinned because it won't be guarded. Instead, white plays c4, forcing the queen to take the pawn. White decides to trade queens. The knight takes, threatening to fork, and white castles. All right, so black is now ahead the bishop pair and a pawn. You might say, well, that's worth about one pawn in the Reinfeldt values. He's got an extra pawn. Look at the engine's evaluation up here. You can see it's at 6.9. That means that not only is black up a pawn, and not only has he got a half a pawn for the bishop pair, but he's got a massive set of threats and lead in development and just a better position, worth 7 pawns. So he really has a gigantic advantage. So he plays a good move. He brings the rook to the open file. And white plays g4, hitting the bishop. And now you don't want to give him the bishop pair for nothing. Yes, it's true when you're ahead you want to trade, but right now, if you're ahead the bishop pair and a pawn, that's about 1.5 pawns of material value, even though you're ahead more than that in position. If you give him the bishop pair back, you're losing half out of that 1.5, which is a third of your advantage. And actually, watch what happens if black takes that knight. Right now, black is up 7.5. If he he gave him a check first. And now he should save the bishop and be up 8 pawns. He takes the knight. Look how much he lost when he trades the bishop for the knight. Even though he's up a pawn and he's trading, and you say, well, when you're ahead, you want to trade. Here, that's not a fair trade, and black goes from ahead 8.1 pawns to ahead 4.9. It's almost as if he lost an entire piece by doing that. So a much, much better move was to move the bishop back. I would have gone all the way back to c8 or e6. The engine says they're all good. Your top 3 moves are to move the bishop back. Don't be afraid to move your pieces back, especially the fast pieces, the rooks, the bishops, and the queens. If you move them back, they still can go all the way across the board. Giving up the bishop pair for nothing here with bishop takes e4 check is just really bad idea. So knight takes e4, and now black should continue to, now he could just trade, and he should play knight takes c1, and if black plays rook takes c1, I would not play bishop takes b2, because rook b1 would then skewer the bishop and get the rook to the 7th rank. But here I would just play something like rook to d4 and double attack the knight and the pawn, and then double my rooks on the open d file, and with a pretty easy win. You're up a pawn, you have the good position. Instead, black plays the strange move rook d3. By the way, rook d4 immediately before even taking the bishop is even better, because it hits the knight and the pawn, and the only way to save the pawn would be to play knight d2, but that allows removal of the guard. I can play knight takes c1, and white can't recapture without losing the knight. So rook d4 is actually the best move. The second best move is just take the bishop, although the engine says it's the third best move. The second best move in terms of winning the game easily, I guess I should say. Black plays rook to d3, hitting the g2 pawn, which can easily be held. White develops the bishop and holds the pawn, but now black can't trade the knight for the bishop. And also, as you can see here with these arrows, the knight is starting to get trapped. It doesn't have a lot of places to go. In fact, right now, the only safe place is to go to d4, and that means the rook on d3 is awkward, and white can play moves like knight to c5, trapping the rook. So you don't want to do things like this. You don't want to get your pieces where they can't retreat or they can't move. This is exactly the opposite of what black should be doing. So if we go back a few moves, black's advantage was 8.1. Let's watch how move after move after move, his advantage starts to go down to 0 and then goes to a white advantage. So first he gives up the bishop pair for nothing. Then he puts the rook on an awkward square and does not trade the knight for the bishop. Now the bishop move saves the pawn and partially traps the knight. Now black's advantage is down to 2.4. Black again puts his pieces all jumbled together, bishop d4. Now the rook is back to being trapped again, and now black's advantage is down to 0.9. It was 8.1 3 moves ago. Now it's 0.9. White says, let's trade off the rooks, and that's what black should do, which he does. He trades the rooks, so there's nothing being trapped. And now he has to figure out how can he get that knight out. The best way to get the knight out, according to the engine, is to play either f5, which is a little complicated, or just take the bishop. And when he takes back, you need a place to put the knight, and right now you don't have one. So you have to create one. And the best way to do that is to play f5 to get the knight off of this square so that you can get your knight out. And if you do this, black has a very slight advantage here. Most of his advantage, of course, is way gone. All right, instead, black pins his own rook. So now the bishop is pinned and it can't move. And notice there's no place for the bishop to go back and guard the rook. If the bishop goes back to f6 or b6, the pawns are in the way and doesn't guard the rook. So now we've got the bishop pinned, the knight trapped, the rook is unguarded, white's creating all kinds of trouble, and now black's creating trouble, and now white's up by 5.3. So again, let's look at that sequence. Black is up by 8.7, now he's up by 4.9, now he's up by 2.4, now he's up by 0.9, and now he's down by 5.3. So now white has combinations to win material. The easiest one, I think, is knight to c3. The bishop can't take because he loses the rook with check. And if the knight takes, then white can just take back with the pawn, and the bishop can't take anything because the rook would be hanging, and white's just winning a piece. And meanwhile, the knight c3 hits the knight on e2, which is not only trapped, but is trying to guard the bishop on d4. And so knight c3 wins a piece outright here if white would do that. If you don't understand this, like if you say, Dan, you went too fast. All right, here we go. Let's look at it in slow motion instant replay. Knight takes e2 is the threat. Everybody should understand if black does nothing, white could take off his knight. How do you stop that? Well, if you take his knight and he takes back with the pawn, this bishop is pinned. If you take his bishop, he'll take check. And when you get out of check, he'll take the bishop and he's up a whole rook. On the other hand, if you don't move the bishop at all, you just try to guard it, he'll just take it with a pawn. You take back, he'll say, let's trade. I'm up a bishop in the endgame. And white's completely winning. On the other hand, what can black do? White's threatening knight takes knight. If he moves the knight to g3 check, then white can just take it. And again, even though that removes the guard on the bishop, we can't take it because rook takes rook wins material, puts white ahead a whole rook. So the knight has nowhere to go. Same thing with knight f4, just take it off. Or we could even just take off the bishop now with rook takes d4. So everything's just winning here. The threat of knight takes knight. If he can't play bishop takes, because then rook takes check again, king takes, pawn takes, and he's up a rook. So knight c3, if you're not familiar with tactics like this, these are combinations of pins, removal of the guards, and counting. Those three tactics are involved with this move. That's the kind of thing that you want to be able to see. Well, instead, white plays king to g2, and now e5 would minimize the danger here for black, and that's what he plays, overprotecting the bishop, giving the knight also a place to go in some of the lines. And now white should play king f3 and hit the knight, and he does. And now white plays his best move, knight f4. And now black should play the tricky move, white should play the tricky move, rook takes d4, to try to win two pieces for a rook. So let's go through that. Rook takes d4, you might say, but rooks are worth more than bishops. Why would I give up a rook for a bishop? Well, in order for him to get the rook, he has to recapture it. If he recaptures with the rook, then you take that rook, and now the knight will hang because this pawn is overworked. If he takes the bishop, you take the knight, and if he saves the knight, then you take the pawn. Or if he saves the knight over this way, you could just save your bishop, and you're ahead a piece. If you play rook takes d4, and he takes with the pawn, then white has lost the exchange, but he gets a knight back right away with bishop takes f4, and two pieces are worth a lot more than a rook. And if you look at the evaluation, it has white up by 2.6 pawns, which should be plenty enough to win the game. Anything over 1 should win. So the only winning move here for white is to take off the bishop with the rook. Why doesn't it work to take it the other ways? Well, we'll look at that in a second. But if you take with the rook, you get two pieces for rook. A lot of my lower rated students miss stuff like this, and they say, I can't take the bishop because bishops are worth more than rooks. But that's only true if you look at the first capture. If you keep going and go through all the captures, like for instance, if you take with the pawn to try to get it, then you should see that the pawn was overworked and you get the knight. If you take with the rook, not only am I getting the exchange back with bishop takes rook, but also I'm winning the knight on top of it. So again, if you're not good at these kind of combinations, you might want to copy this position, put it in your study book, or if you don't have a study book, create one, and say, I need to study stuff like this so I don't miss easy tactics. Because I think almost every player rated above 17 or 1800 would, unless they're in time trouble, would get this right for white, because they would look at all their checks, captures, and threats, and they would realize, oh, the best one is to take the bishop with the rook. So instead, white makes a mistake. He plays bishop takes d4, which actually pretty much loses the game, puts him down 2.0. Now black has two ways to take back. Which one is the right one? Is it rook takes or is it pawn takes? And the answer is neither. If you take with the rook, the pawn is overworked again, and rook takes, pawn takes, king takes will win a piece. If you take with the pawn, that immediately unguards your knight, removes the guard, and king takes f4 wins a piece. So the right move, believe it or not, is to not recapture right away, but play knight e6 so the king can't take the knight. And now you're hitting the bishop 3 times, but the rook is unguarded behind the bishop, so the bishop is pinned, and the bishop cannot go back and guard the rook because the bishop's a dark squared bishop and the rook's on a light square. So no matter what white does, black's going to win that bishop on the next move. Let's say he plays, I don't know, b3, and then knight takes d4 check, and black's back up a pawn like he was originally. So both sides are making counting errors, they're making tactical errors, they're just not figuring out the checks, captures, and threats. So after bishop takes d4, my student didn't play this move really fast. It wasn't an error in time management, but he just didn't realize the bishop was pinned and that he needed to save the knight. And he made a monster blunder. Right now, if he moves the knight, he's up 2.0, but he took with the rook, and now he's down 6.4, so that was an 8.4 pawn blunder to take with the rook. That's the kind of moves that lose you games. I always get students saying to me, oh, I need to learn my openings better, I need to study the Caro-Kann. Someone played a line against me I didn't know and I panicked. Well, okay, those things are all true, but if you do things like this wrong, it doesn't matter how, you could memorize 10 books on the Caro-Kann and every other opening you want, and if you get these kind of simple capturing sequences wrong, then people who are, take their time and figure them out correctly and realize, oh, I'm not going to make these quiescent errors of it would be a quiescent error to think that rook can't take the bishop on d4 because you're losing the exchange. All you have to do is calculate the lines and figure it out. But a lot of weaker players, they just stop and say, bishops are worth less than rooks. I can't take the bishop with my rook. If you do that, you're going to stay a low-rated player. You need to work through the sequences and see what happens. So bishop takes, rook takes, triple question mark, rook takes, pawn takes, king takes. And now my student says, hey, wait a second, I'm down a knight. b6, b4, trying to stop c5, king f8, king e5. And of course that pawn's going to fall because if he pushes the pawn down the board, the knight's going to watch it. So he realizes he's losing the pawn and he's just down a knight, and he goes, how did I get down the knight? I guess I resign. All right, let's go through the whole game really quickly with the good and bad. Pierre's defense. h3, not the main move, but not terrible. Bishop c4, inaccurate. Center fork trick, that's the right idea. Now black has the bishop pair. Queen d3, not the best way to do it. Allows a pin. Best way to get out of the pin is to counterattack with knight c3. Knight e2. Now black could just take the pawn. Knight c6 is slightly better, but more complicated. It's more like a computer move. c4, forcing the queen to take the pawn. He does. Queen takes, knight takes. Castle, rook over, good move. g4. Knight checks. I would just move the bishop back. Something like bishop c8 here. It's very simple. You're just winning. I know people hate to move their bishops back to where they started, but the bishop is very powerful there. You can always fianchetto it later if you have to. Knight checks unnecessary, not terrible. And now definitely move the bishop back. Bishop takes, the start of a series of disastrous moves for black. Knight takes, rook d3, not disastrous, but not the right idea. Bishop e3, good idea. Saving the h3 pawn, saving the bishop, blocking the knight in, all in one move. Bishop d4, basically trapping his own pieces. Now black's advantage is almost down to nothing. Rook a d1, he trades. Rook d8, pinning his own rook, and now white's completely winning. White misses knight c3. Black plays e5, trying to minimize the danger. White plays king f3, and now white can win with rook takes d4. Instead, he plays bishop takes d4, and now black can win with just save the knight and have the bishop pinned, and you get it on the next move. Instead, he plays triple question mark, rook takes d4, going from a winning position to a losing one and one recapture. Rook takes, pawn takes, gets the knight, goes after the pawn, and black resigns. Okay, so if these things happen to you, then learn from others' mistakes and get to be a better player. So if you liked the video, please tell your friends about my channel, Dan Heisman Chess. Right now I'm working on my 13th chess book, so I'm not doing as many videos right now as I was previously. But the good news is I have videos that cover almost every single possible improvement issue that we could in the 320 plus videos that I have on my channel. If you like the video, you can like it. If you haven't subscribed, you can do that. Best thing to do, though, is tell your friends about the channel. Thanks very much. We'll see you next time. Bye.